Oh, they're closing the doors. They're locking the doors. Yeah, straggler. Well, welcome and good morning. Well, am I on? Can anybody hear me okay? All right. Well, originally the title is Beyond Bad, IP addresses, hashes, and domain names. What I'm going to call I was awake from the crystal meth party, so I'm just going to show up someplace. So, for those of you who came in, I do appreciate coming in 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning after the party, especially after they didn't put my title up. So it was just my name, which makes me sound like a narcissistic douche. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about Ed McCabe. Why? No. So good morning. What we're going to talk about today is the necessity in threat intelligence to do analysis. So getting beyond bad IP addresses, bad hashes, and bad names. So a little bit about myself. I'm an Iowa farm boy. I grew up, I had a pony. I wish. So I was homeschooled until going into high school, and these were most of the things that I dealt with. And if you can recognize some of them, yes, that is an actual acoustic coupler for a modem. For those of you who don't know what that is, we actually had to dial into the internet before we actually had it on our phones. As you can possibly imagine, this made me very popular with the women. So when I finally ended up going to high school, I might have been a geek, which, by the way, being having the chess club as your posse is not going to help you when you're being put into a dumpster. I am a veteran of the United States Navy. Any other veterans out here? Thank you very much for your service, gentlemen. Greatly appreciated. And yes, I actually thought I could pull off this mustache. Then I became an information security professional. I actually, came into it as a career and felt that, hey, I can take my knowledge and what I've learned and help organizations to be able to do this. That started about 20 years ago. Or actually, no, 25 years ago now. My wife says that I talk too much, corresponded by the fact that if you Google me, this is what you will find. And I wasn't always jaded. Somebody actually asked me, they're like, well, how do we know that's you? Come on, man, look at the ears. The ears have not changed. But yes, it is true, I am jaded. I've been doing this for 25 years now. I've been in information security and information security operations management for 25 years. And yes, I am now to the point in my career where when something bad happens, I just sit back and I grin like the Cheshire Cat. So now, how many of us have seen this before? Yeah, this looks pretty damn sexy, right? And we put this on our displays when our executives and leadership walk into the office and they're like, you guys are really doing something, it looks pretty. Ooh, ah, wow, amazing. But ultimately, when we're talking about threat intelligence, we're also talking about how to get in front of these types of attacks. How do we get in front of malware distribution? Bulk spammers. Anybody ever have to deal with bulk spamming? Yeah. Not a fun thing to have to deal with or clean up, right? Phishing campaigns against our organizations. Dealing with known botnets. You get that call at 2 o'clock in the morning, hey, we're seeing a lot of activity beaconing out to some place. For those of you who have FireEye, getting those alerts that say, hey, we have identified that your organization is communicating with a known threat actor. We do threat intelligence in order to ensure that we can defend our businesses, make better decisions, and reduce the impact of business. Because ultimately, how many of you have the actual resources and the unlimited budget that you actually need to protect your organizations? Anybody? One? So you're with the NSA, right? Oh, okay, well. So today, what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about how I got involved in threat intelligence in the commercial sector, talk about what a threat intelligence program is, the importance of analysis, and then we're going to take a look at a case study for actually watching and analyzing data that came through and being able to track it back and attribute it to a potential threat to our organization. Then we'll talk about the business value. So ultimately, I am qualified. How I got started in this, pardon me. We used to have security through obscurity, and now a lot of our businesses are working on, hope, faith, and denial. It's not going to happen to us. We're hoping that, we're not big enough to be on anybody's radar. This is my favorite one that I have heard. I actually had somebody tell us we don't have anything anybody would want, which sort of begs the next question of how are you in business? I love some of the things that I hear as a consultant that come out, and it's like, well, we have nothing that anybody would want. And I'm like, you're a multi-billion-dollar organization. I'm going to disagree. So a lot of this ended up making me ask the basic questions: whiskey, tango, foxtrot. Now, as you can see, I'm a chubby little white guy. Well, I can't really dance, but I can drink whiskey. And then I got accused of being a FUD peddler at a conference when we were talking about how bad things are actually on the internet. And somebody had made mention of the fact that, we've got this, you can come online and it's no problem. And I'm like, no, you're getting attacked constantly. You just don't realize it. And a sales engineer, any sales engineers in the room? Okay, good. Don't raise your hand because you're going to get bashed. Accused me of being a FUD peddler. That made me upset. Now, if you take somebody that's got over 20 years in the industry and you accuse them of FUD, there's one of two things that's going to happen. One of them is going to include a very sharp, pointy stick, or they're just going to put their tail between their legs and walk off. I go for the pointy stick. So, based upon the information that I had available, I kept on going back to the root questions that the root statements that companies were making. And they made me really think, is this something we need to address? Is this a area that businesses actually believe this? Are they rolling the dice trying to protect themselves? So when we talk about threat intelligence, and when we talk about adversaries in specific, and I'm using adversaries at a very high level, there's two things I want to share with you that two of my closest peers and colleagues have told me. So anybody know Robert M. Lee? I can't. Okay. So Rob loves to be able to tell the following, that you have zero influence you have zero influence on an adversary choosing to target and attack you. How many of you believe that you can go back and, negotiate with, Anonymous to say, hey, take us off your radar? Or tell the criminal syndicates that, hey, please don't fish us, the weekend's coming up and I don't want to work. My partner at Rendition, the company that I work with, is very fond of saying that unlike the attacker, the target gets to choose the field of battle. All the systems that haven't been patched in the last 3 years? Or the Windows XP systems that are still in our environment that are, exploitable? That is our field of battle. The importance of understanding this is to put yourself in the mindset of the adversary, because ultimately, nation states, criminal syndicates, hacktivists, terrorists, insiders, they don't care about maintenance windows. They don't care about contracts that protect you. How many of you have the contract or the lawyer that's like, well, we meet all the requirements of the contract, so we're good. Yeah, that doesn't work with I don't see the criminal syndicates whipping open the thing and going, oh, they're covered by a contract, we can't do this. So going back to earlier being accused of being a FUD peddler, to demonstrate the fact that attacks are actually real and happening, I built one of these. I love honeypots. The information and value that you can get beyond just a sheer academic perspective is great. Later on this morning, there's going to be a talk by a gentleman named Eric Wita, who's going to be doing on long tail. Thank you, Eric. Who's going to be doing long tail analysis around SSH attacks. Highly recommend it, especially since you're already up and moving. So I built my initial honeypot, and then it got a little out of hand, and I ended up calling in favors and markers with friends, family, which, by the way, after years of telling my grandmother not to click a link to download something, when I told her, no, download this from this email, and she's like, well, you tell me never to click the link, and I'm like, I'm your grandson, you can trust me, and she's like, but it came in through email. Job was done, I did well. So let's talk about threat intelligence programs. And for most of us, when we hear threat intelligence nowadays, you know, what is it that normally happens when a vendor comes on site? They talk about threat intelligence, and they talk about their data that they have, and, you know, buy our list of bad. You can buy it. So, little spoiler alert. Indicators of compromise, websites, domain names, not threat intelligence. Vendors will try to get you to believe that this is threat intelligence. And we'll get to the vendors in a minute. This is also not threat intelligence. I actually had somebody who said, you know, well, we'll Google that out. That's our TI method. No, that's a tool. The value that threat intelligence can bring to an organization when properly utilized is great. However, you have to realize that it is just another tool. I had an actual client that said, hey, if we buy threat intelligence, we don't have to monitor our network. And I was like, no. What are you smoking? And can I have some? It's not a replacement for actual people on the ground. It's meant to be a force multiplier and an augmenter. It's not meant to be a replacement. So some common misconceptions when it comes to threat intelligence is that you can buy it. You know, pre-made, comes right off the shelf, right? Because that works so great with vulnerability scanning engines, right? You know, we can buy those and they come in and we run them against our networks, and then they provide all these high alerts. And we take those high alerts and we take them to the business, and they look at us and go, no, that's not a high impact to our organization. Same thing is starting to happen when it comes to threat intelligence, is they're inundating us with a lot of information, and it doesn't have the impact and value that it can have. Second option is that it requires the NSA's budget. It requires a large amount of capital to be able to do this. It does require investments. However, if you invest wisely in your people and the processes, the technology can be predominantly executed via open source systems. One size fits all. Again, going back to the area of vulnerability assessments, one tool will rule the entire network. Doesn't work as well when you're talking in threat intelligence either. Also, that it's only for information technology and security practitioners. Now, when we start talking about threat intelligence, what we're ultimately talking about is being able to provide information around making decisions. So threat intelligence, when we look at it, is an actual business management program. The technology is a supporting aspect of that. The IP addresses, the domain names, the hashes, those are just part of it. What threat intelligence allows is providing that strategic advantage with tactical application. Being able to take the forward look and getting out in front of those attacks, in front of those phishing campaigns, out in front of those known scanning adversaries. Again, 7 steps. What we're going to focus on today and talk about today is more around the analysis of that information. And we have tons of it available to us. We're all doing centralized logging, right? Couple? Our logs can tell us a lot of information around some of the technical threats that we're seeing within our organization, both at the perimeter and internal to our organization. However, we definitely, when it comes to threat intelligence, do not lack available data. There is more information that is available to us in present day than there has ever been before. However, being able to get through it and analyze it requires that we leverage tools. That ensures that we have to have the proper processes in place prior to going that far. We can take all this information and correlate it with the technical aspects, the IP addresses, the domain names. You know, the Syrian Electronic Army hasn't registered the SyrianElectronicArmy.com, have they? Anybody? No? They're a little bit more subversive than that, right? But we can take that type of information, correlate it, and we can start protecting our businesses a little more. The information is available in multiple formats and often is freely available. And we can take these tools, we can take these sources of information, these data feeds, aggregate them and pull them together. Some of them are paid. I highly recommend that if you're going to pay for a data feed, that you do your due diligence and you ask some very hard questions. Because a sales engineer today, when it comes to threat intelligence, and it is a very hot topic, everybody seems today is providing threat intelligence. You have this guy. Anybody ever run into him? Yep. A couple of us? Good. So he has raw data, but he calls it threat intelligence. And we'll get to this here in a few. So ultimately, we all know vendor speak, right? What they say versus what they mean. So when he's talking about having a unique data set, what he's actually talking about is that he's pulling the device logs off of your infrastructure that you've already paid for. They're running open source tools a lot of the time. Everybody seems to build off of the open source community and move it forward. Anybody ever hear of the proprietary analysis techniques yet? Does anybody actually know what that means? No, they actually don't understand the output of the tools. But because of the fact that the tool says this, it must be bad. I love this one. Anybody hear the global network of sensors, right? You know what that actually translates to? Honeypots, and again, your device logs. And then they come back and say, you need threat intelligence. And again, he's trying to sell raw data. Now, the one thing that I always tell people when it comes to threat intelligence, ask one question and one question alone of your vendors. Why is it a threat to me? If I'm in financial services industry, if I'm working at a bank, am I going to see the same threats that I would inside of academia? No. Am I going to see the same thing in healthcare? Probably not. I tend to walk around so my mic goes in and out, so I'm going to take this off. So why is it a threat to me? If the vendor cannot answer that one simple question, and usually the answer should be a derivative of, we have done analysis within that industry specific to your organization. That's ultimately what it comes in, because as our organizations differ, so do the threats. And not all threats are equal. So here we have two threats. Which one is the bigger threat, do you think? My left, your left. The kid? So just recently, for the shoes, this was released recently from a adversary known as Sexy Cyborg. She printed out a pair of high heels on a 3D printer and embedded tools that could be used for nefarious purposes. Now, for those of you who are wondering, the one on the right, yes, he is a threat. Just a different type of threat. Again, not all threats are equal. Is this a threat to our organizations? What's... Absolutely. They kind of made the news in a bad way, right? Not that they were doing anything good to begin with, but is this a threat to our organizations? Absolutely. What happens after a large-scale data breach? Exploitation, blackmail, security budgets go up. Get me out of their database now. So, being able to get information like this as it becomes relevant and taking action on it can ensure that your users, whether or not they're actually signed up for it, are aware not to respond to emails like this, where they're being blackmailed. However, this is not one of the traditional threats that are being promoted. Again, buy my list of bad. Buy my list of bad. If you buy a list of bad, it's not going to protect you from these types of attacks. And is this a threat to your organization? Absolutely. So now we're going to move into the necessity for analysis and why analysis of data and information in a whole is important. Because it allows us to turn around pardon me, and validate the information on finding out whether it's a threat to us. We can turn around and assess, categorize, prioritize our resources, because we all have the unlimited resources as we were defined early, except for the guy with the NSA. And we can answer those questions. Is it a threat to our organization? Does it pose a risk to us? Now, originally when I started this, I had mentioned that I had collected stuff. And if you were here last year, I went through the entire process of how I processed stuff. So I got all this information, collected it, aggregated it, and processed it. I even went so far as when a colleague of mine who, because how many of us are familiar or comfortable, more comfortable at a command line? Yeah, that's right. Is management or leadership comfortable at command line? No. So while I'm comfortable at processing stuff and dealing with information in a textual base, I even went as far as I started dashboarding stuff. Now this looks really pretty, right? Yeah. And when I took an initial look at the data, do you know what I found? China. However, that doesn't always mean that, the chicken-shaped country in the East is the one responsible for it. We needed to apply a little bit of analysis efforts behind it. We needed to be able to take a look at the data and, heaven forbid, apply a little science to things. There's a great quote by Colin Powell when it comes to intelligence. Tell me what you know, tell me what you don't, tell me what you think. Always distinguish between which is which. We don't want to make assumptions when it comes to analysis, and we definitely don't want to step in front of the speaker. That might get a little loud. We need to be able to look at analysis where we need to analyze the data to ensure that what we're seeing is in fact true. And that we're not, heaven forbid, jumping to conclusions. So again, when we come to analysis, leave your feelings at the door. IP address from China must be China, right? I love the shirt that I saw out here that said, you can't always blame Canada. Because, it's so far out of what we consider norm in InfoSec that, it just made me laugh. So when we talk about analysis, apply some science, maybe some math. I hear that most schools that aren't homeschooled have these types of things, right? So we'll talk about the analysis of competing hypotheses. Going back to the basic scientific method and coming up with what is the purpose of what has happened and what are alternate hypotheses that could be that could fit the model of what we're looking for. It forces us to take a look at it. We'll look at playing devil's advocate. Putting yourself in the position of, regardless of what you see, taking the opposite position to be able to force and drive those questions. And then red teaming, putting yourself in the adversary's mindset. So I'm going to try some science. Who likes science? That is awesome. So I have two rather young ladies that are my daughters. One is 18 and is 20, and when I invited them to come down to DerbyCon, they're like, "You're going down with a bunch of nerds." And I'm like, "No, geeks, number one. Two, hackers, and we are the ones who are actually running the world." They did not want to hear that. So apparently to my young daughters, or my older daughters, computers are still not the key thing. Science, however, is always going to be one of the mainstays. So the basic scientific method when it comes to dealing with running to ground truth. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you have to come up with alternate hypotheses. You can't just believe automatically that because the IP address comes from China, that it's China. Another key area to remember is the need for objectivity. Challenge those key assumptions. What we see, is what we see actually what it is, or is there something deeper that we're missing? The mental mindsets. We all have what's called cognitive biases. We have automatically created a what we expect to see and what we're going to ultimately find. We have to be able to get beyond that. Ultimately, this is for the purposes of reducing the potential impact of coming up with the wrong idea. How many of us have ever worked firewall administration? A couple of us. Has anybody ever made when you're reviewing the firewalls, you see the one IP address going to an unknown IP address that we can't account for, so we take the initiative to shut it down? Yeah. How many of us have ever accidentally, impacted the business by doing that? Yeah. We want to reduce the chance of surprise. We want to run and get to ground truth. We want to understand and make sure that what we're seeing is actually the case. Anybody in here familiar with the analysis of competing hypotheses? So it's to get over the biases because of the fact that reasoning tends to be subjective. It ensures that we come up with alternating hypotheses, and this is a practical application that we've actually recently done with a client of ours when we were asked, "Why do you believe this?" So we actually modeled it out for him and said, based upon the different hypotheses we actually created, based upon the likelihood of an event occurring, this is why we believe this, and the evidence supports it. So when we're talking about our biases, the IP address from China must be China. Our cognitive biases. The human mind likes to see patterns that may not always exist, and we get tunnel focused on some things. We want to prevent that when we're talking about threat intelligence. And again, jumping to conclusions. Now, one of the things I always like to do is talking about the cognitive biases. What do we see up here on the board? Some of us awake yet? What do we have on the far right? I think of the far right. Some see a tiger, some see a cat. Does anybody see a frog? Anybody see the upset man? Our minds have the ability to find a pattern, but yet some of us only saw the tiger, or some of us only saw the monkey. We have to force ourselves to be able to get out of that mindset and break that pattern and to be able to actually move forward from it. How many of you just see the skull? Just one? Does anybody see, with regards to the skull, do they see the two girls playing with toys? This is important in threat intelligence because we want a challenge to make sure that we're actually seeing. Bet you guys didn't think you'd be seeing Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino this morning, right? Yeah, this is going to be a star-studded presentation. I do have some great sponsors. Has anybody picked up on that yet? Somebody asked me, they're like, how did you manage to get those sponsors? And I'm like, hey. They volunteered themselves. So devil's advocate, or the 10th man rule, being able to take the opposite opinion, regardless of what your personal beliefs are on the situation, and putting yourself to force thought, to create that area of, or that situation where it makes you think beyond the immediate. For those of you, anybody in here admit to seeing World War Z, where they talked about the 10th man rule and how it was that Israel was prepared for the zombies? This is the same thing when it comes to devil's advocate, or the 10th man rule, is no matter what all the evidence laid out, take the position that it's not the right thing. Force harder. Red teaming. Putting yourself in the mindset of the adversary. I do not know how many times that I've worked with an organization and they will come back and they will be like, well, nobody would ever do that to us. Why not? Well, that's an extreme case. We just make hammers. We have nothing worth stealing. The way that criminal syndicates, the way that our adversaries view our systems, our businesses, is completely different than the way we do, because they have identified a financial gain through exploiting our systems. Anybody in here do pen testing? Commercially, maybe volunteer? Okay. Has anybody ever heard somebody come back and said, you are so good, we're not going to be really that concerned about it because you're so good, nobody else could find it? We've all heard that, right? That is management's dodge of trying to get out of it. Now, when we've taken over networks, I love to hear that, because I will look at them and go, I'm an Iowa farm boy. I was sponsored and motivated by the paltry sum of the contract value. I know what you do professionally. I know the value of your intellectual property. A motivated, funded adversary will spend more time than, the 30 minutes you gave me on Sunday morning between 4 and 5 a.m. to execute, and they will go long haul. They will go low and slow. Oh, and they will fish. Whereas you won't let me, because you already admitted that, we won't survive a phishing attack. But asking yourself those questions, what are the motivations of your adversary? Being able to talk about what their resources are. Working with a client, I was cracking up to hear an IT department tell me, we clean the systems. After a very large-scale, motivated and funded adversary. And I was like, okay, let's stop for a second and get back to reality. This is a very highly skilled organization that is trained to maintain long-term persistence in organizations to achieve their goals. Please tell me, for the love of all that is holy, what clean the system actually means. Well, we ran, insert antivirus of choice. And I was like, yeah, that doesn't work. They actually thought that they could go in and manipulate, run antivirus, run Symantec, McAfee, Kaspersky, all at the same time, apparently, is how that turned out. And that would magically clean the systems. What they didn't understand is that antivirus will not pick up known authorized software, like an @ job that the adversary creates to beacon back home and open the back door back up. Why wouldn't AV catch that? Oh, because it's not a malicious piece of software. well, Microsoft in whole could be considered malicious. So let's talk a little bit about brute force attacks, because a lot of folks get in when we talk and we see these. We see that our root accounts being just hammered away at, right? Does that surprise anybody? No? They're going to try and go after the privileged accounts. Well, what about the not so privileged accounts? Are we looking at those even? No, because root is sexy, right? If it's not root, it must not be important. Well, what are they actually going after? If we start doing some analysis, we're going to find some really interesting things. We're going to be able to put some information together. Now, what purpose might an adversary have interest in a Polycom system? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Charge long distance calls. Here, over here, and that. Are those bad things? Are those threats to organizations? So by doing a little analysis, we're able to see what some of the attack patterns are. Diving into the data, we can actually see what applications they're actually using. In this case, is very specific to PuTTY, or not PuTTY, SSH. As we can see, there's different variants. I never realized that somebody actually created a port for SSH in .NET. That's a really strange thing to do, but hey, rock on. I love this one, because when I started doing a little bit of research around this very, very small attempt, saw it was an implementation by Core Lab, did a little bit of research, found out it talked to back-end databases, and then my next article that I came across was this one, releasing a disclosure around a vulnerability that could be easily exploited. So I could probably make the expectation that the adversary, the last IP address that it was coming from, was probably not the actual attacker, but somebody who had been compromised. And they were just reusing the infrastructure. Dealing with these types of brute force attacks, and we can tell the difference by looking at them, because math, we can tell whether or not they're automated attacks or not. So looking through our logs, we see this, right? I looked at this and I told the client, I was like, you've got a botnet. Or you have a bot that's on your system that's randomly testing systems and trying to get in. Well, how do you know that's not a person? So we did a little analysis around time series, because math. And I pointed out that 41 passwords attempted in a 60-second period was probably not going to happen unless the adversary was the Flash. Could be an adversary. I mean, any Marvel superhero fans? Yeah. So we'll take a look at a little case study. So a good friend of mine, Andrew Morris, provided this. And if you haven't worked with Kippo before, one of the unique capabilities with Kippo is the ability to record what actually goes on. So we get the data coming through, and we're starting to notice what looks like to be a common attack. And I want you to watch this for a few minutes. Everybody catch that? How many scripts or bots will back up, use the backspace? So we've actually got a live human adversary, which is really cool when you think about it. At the same time, it makes you want to break into the session and start talking to them like, hey, I caught you. But we don't want to do that because we want to be able to catch some information. Now, I can tell you just by looking at this initially, he's probably not familiar with the concept of honeypots because he's been trying to run the same command over and over. He uploaded the file. So we're seeing a lot of activity go on here. So let's do a little deconstruction and analysis. So we saw him download a specific script from that domain, right? That's cool. So we'll do the same thing. Oh, FYI, as we're going through this, one of the things, and I'm not a lawyer, but when I give legal advice, I will tell you, copywriting your malware, not a good idea. Now, I could be wrong, and they could, because malware does tend to be reused. It could be that I'm mistaken, but the more I'm looking at this, the more I'm walking through it, the more information we get. Now, what was really cool was when I went out to the first website, and for those of you who are wondering, yes, I run a Mac, but what was really cool was the fact that my Mac was breached by a system32.exe problem. Which, that put the fear of God into me, because, if they're so good that they were able to cause a system32.exe issue on a Mac, that is just, unbelievable. So we started doing a little research around some of the information we found. Found out they have their own YouTube channel. That's pretty interesting. Did a little bit more research. Let's find out who actually owns that, because if you're going to put it in your malware, we're going to do a little research. Found out the individual. Now, it should never be this easy, right? Should. So we ended up looking up the IP address. Looks like he's coming out of Singapore. Matches the domain. Matches the information. It's an actual VPS and SSH hosting service that offers surprisingly very low rates for ease of access, and I wonder why. So we started doing some additional information, again, looking for some common vectors, some commonality between the information we're pulling together. Found another domain that they owned, so now we can take that information and take action on that as well. Now, it can never get really this easy. We found yet another YouTube channel that he owns. He's very hot on YouTube. This was the best part, was able to actually find his picture. So, another thing about malware, when you write it, don't reference yourself and don't put your Facebook page in the malware. That might be bad. That might be bad. But being able to find out and get to this level of detail was only done through doing the analysis. This becomes important because as we drive through and do the analysis, it does bring business value. And the reason why, it helps our organizations and our leadership understand that what the media is portraying as our adversaries is not really the case. How many of us actually believe that we are fighting, a 12-year-old in their grandparents' basement on their laptops? I think the best one so far to date to our industry is this one right here. So, in 25 years in information security, I have never found a threat this easy to find, where it's just called out directly in the code. Anybody else? I do bad stuff subroutine? No? Nor have I ever had nuclear reactors explode on me. I have never had to run an adversary down wearing a bulletproof vest, nor have I had to draw down on one. In fact, usually when people talk with folks in information security, specifically around security operations, pen testing, network defense, what do they normally think of? Right? However, this is really cool because thanks to Black Hat and Chris Hemsley, this is now what we are. This is what my wife wish I was. But leadership sees these, they see the movies and they think, this is our adversary. The worst thing to our industry to have ever come out from a media perspective, CSI Cyber. Because all cyber threats can be stopped and rectified in under an hour. Why can't it be this easy? These are not the adversaries we face. Our real adversaries are our insiders, nation state, criminal syndicates, Organizations that have method, opportunity, skills, motivation, and funding to bring impact to our organizations. The web has been weaponized, and the war is already going on. We're seeing organizations leveraging it more. They're using it in combined attacks. They're using it to actually make and influence organizations. Now, the sad part is, this is nothing new. This has been going on for several years. But yet we keep not wanting to accept it. Any stock traders in here? Anybody watch the stock market? Does anybody know what this is? Very bad day. Specifically, it was the result of a single tweet. One tweet. Billions of dollars were lost over one tweet. Not even 140 characters. They didn't even go the whole 440. They were frugal with their tweeting. I might have heard that there was an individual that was involved that made a comment via Twitter about a plane maybe going sideways. That resulted in some questions. This is the battlefront that we're working in. This is the impact that it's actually happening. The cyber is going kinetic. And I hate to use the term cyber, but why not? It's Sunday morning. So why is this important and why now? Why is threat intelligence becoming more and more important? And why is it more than just IP addresses? And why is it more than just IOCs and hashes and domain names? Well, this allows us to get out in front, taking information in, and get out in front of these threats. We kind of have a responsibility to protect our organizations, right? I mean, we all get paid to protect our organizations. Maybe. Sometimes. Our customers would really appreciate it if we protected their information. The threats are real and they're not new. We've been seeing attacks go on. Move away. Or that could be your wake-up call. We've been seeing these attacks go on for quite some time. If we lose our competitive edge in our business, we're not going to be in business that much longer. So again, threat intelligence from a business perspective, and keeping in mind most business leadership doesn't really speak technology. We've been trying for years to help translate for them and educate them, so I find it's easier to talk in their terms. We can be able to answer some strategic questions. Who would be interested in us? We're a very large financial institution. Would anybody be interested in us? Yes, they would, as it turns out. Why are they coming after you? You have money. Point A, point B. Not a hard lesson to learn. Where are they coming from? Not China. Not if they're financially motivated. We can answer some of the questions on how they're coming after us and what we can do to better protect ourselves, our organization. We do this through enhancing our operations within daily business, providing an increased situational awareness. You don't want to fly to this country today because it's bad. Well, what country is that? Iran? Okay, we'll change our travel plans. Understanding the threats, being able to convey that back to the business so that they understand that the threat isn't just, packets on a firewall anymore. It's more than that. Being able to take those resources and prioritize them to ensure maximum defensive capabilities. Focus on other efforts in response to identified threats. So ultimately, you get to a point where you can actually hug the life out of the attack cycle. So by being able to get in there and being able to identify a threat and respond early on, the earlier we're able to catch the threat and respond to it, the less the impact to our organization. How many of you are familiar with the kill chain? Sweet. All right. Kill chain concept, for the most part, we can handle, we have no way of influencing the first three areas when it comes to reconnaissance, weaponization, and delivery. We can't own that. We have no influence on that. The good news is that doesn't cost us anything. Where the costs start coming in are when the systems have been exploited and command and control has been identified. When data has been exfiltrated, that's when the highest cost is going to be. And when that happens, you may end up seeing this guy. Nobody wants to see this guy because he's either going to tell you you're going to need a large sum of money from me or you're fired. So ultimately what you want to get back to is the original question when it comes to threat intelligence. Again, why is it a threat to me? Being able to address that. Getting to root cause around why a specific adversary or a threat or an actor is a threat to the organization. To get to that level, the key takeaways for it today, analysis is required. You're going to start seeing a theme here in a second. In order to do analysis, they have to be properly trained. They have to be skilled. They have to be objective. Nobody wants to surround themselves by a bunch of yes people that will always tell them that there are, fluffy bunnies, unicorns, and double rainbows everywhere. That's not the reality of the world we live in. We need people that are honest enough and courageous enough, but ultimately it comes back to necessity for people. It requires individuals to make sure and go forward. And with that, I think I am done. I've hit my track. Any questions? That's loud. There are no questions?